Get going. It is 8:01 here, and I never like to punish the people who are punctual and on time. So the rest of the folks, as they log in, they can kind of pick up where they join. So good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the weekly agronomy refresh training. We are going to be doing part two today of our yield enhancing products seminar. So for those of you who weren't on last week we really dove deep into the corn side of yield enhancing management. Whereas this week, we're going to pivot and talk about everyone's favorite crop, soybeans. So before we kind of dive into that, Tyler did want me to remind everyone, just as a quick reminder, we are a few short weeks away from the agronomy winter conference being held at the Gateway in Ames. So if you guys have interest in joining that day and a half seminar with some really good topics, make sure you are working with your Winfield United rep to make sure you have the registrations and get all signed up. And we look forward to seeing everyone there. So yield enhancing products. So if you guys,
I,
yeah.
I put the registration link for that in the chat if anybody needs it.
Perfect. So there you go. Thank you, Tyler. So with that, let's dive in here. So if you guys remember last week, if you guys were on last week, there is going to be in the first part here, probably a little bit of overlap, just because I think it's important to frame up what we're trying to do with yield enhancing products. Okay, so again, yield enhancing, I think, Tyler, sometimes can be a little disingenuous. Really what we're trying to do with any of these things for corn and soybeans is to help the plant do something that it already wants to do better, to help it manage stresses, to help it overcome certain obstacles, to help it really flourish and try to create as many viable seeds as it possibly can. So I think sometimes, Tyler, we get in the frame of mind where, hey, I'm going to go add 5 bushels by doing X, Y, Z. Well, yeah, technically we added 5 bushels, but we did it because we allowed that plant to do something more efficiently. And that's really what I think the whole goal of advanced kind of crop management is. So today, guys, there's a lot that goes into enhancing yield and removing barriers and obstacles for any crop, right? So we are going to make the assumption that we already have some prerequisites met, especially in soybeans. We are going to assume we already have good drainage, we already have proper soil pH, we've got our soil fertility built to where we want it, we've got weeds under control, and we've got diseases under control. So what we're going to talk about today is not valued higher than these things. We want to make sure we have these base blocks in place, and then that's where we're going to get the best benefit out of the rest of these things that we're going to talk about. So this is going to be a reused slide from last week, but again, when I think about these things mentally in mental context, when we're trying to help these plants overcome these stresses, really what we are trying to do is help them overcome what I call bottlenecks. And these bottlenecks are really those pieces that come in and prevent all of the other good things that we have done or given to that crop from making its maximum impact. So if we think about this kind of, Tyler, you could think about this in the law of the minimum, right? Like we need to make sure we are working on all of these things together to help that whole system flourish. And if I boil it down to one thing, Tyler, our goal as agronomists is to help address the stress and to help those crops truly focus on what they want to be focusing on, and that's producing seeds and grain. So I would be remiss because I think the challenge here when we talk about corn and soybeans is in the way that they grow and grow differently and how they create yield. And sometimes the mentality that works for corn, we might have to take a slightly different approach to soybeans. So just as a quick review, and we went through this slide last week on corn, it has its components being built throughout the year, but Tyler, what I'm going to call it is it's kind of a stair-stepped approach. It goes from determining how many plants per acre we have, then establishing our maximum kernels around for each year, and that window might take 10 days. And then the next 2 weeks is then all about determining length of those ears, and the next month might be building that whole system and building that whole plant or that plant factory, and then it pivots and switches to to filling and to pollinating and filling those kernels. So you can kind of take a pretty straightforward path to managing corn because of the way that it grows and the way that it builds its yield. soybeans become a little bit more of a challenge. So let's just kind of take a few minutes and review the plant physiology and how soybean plants grow and how they create their yield. So the first thing we have to be thinking about for a soybean is they are what we call indeterminate. So that means they're going to be growing both vegetatively and reproductively at the same time. Corn's not that way, right? Corn, once it reaches reproduction, it's not going to grow vegetatively anymore. It totally switches its mindset and focuses every ounce of energy once it hits that reproductive stage to pollinating and filling those ears. Soybeans, they have a bad attention span, Tyler. They're doing a lot of different stuff at the same time. Okay, and that's part of the problem why soybeans um, respond differently.
So they're
So the
more like,
next thing, are you scatterbrained?
yeah, scatterbrain, just
Yeah, yes. So
yeah.
Tyler is like a soybean. That's what I just
Right.
heard, right? All right.
A little
Scatterbrain,
taller, a
Tyler, soybeans.
little taller.
So now the next one, Tyler, I don't think you're greedy, but I do think soybeans are greedy. Okay. So when I say soybeans are greedy, we have to remember just the way they grow, that if we think about where those pods are located on that plant, right? Those pod clusters are located at the nodes. And the majority of the photoassimilate, so the goods that, the stuff that, is being produced by the leaves, the majority of what that node is going to receive is coming directly from that trifoliate that is attached to it. Okay. So we are going to come back to this a little bit, but I think this is part of the challenge. Again, soybeans are really bad sharers. If I've got a really great trifoliate, it's not going to move its photoassimilate to a node that's 3 or 4 above it. It kind of says, hey, those nodes, you're on your own. You got to get your goodies from the trifoliate and the branch that's attached to you. Okay, so the majority of the goods are coming from the trifoliate in which that node is attached to. Okay, moving on. They are kind of, I'm going to call loosely fixed. Is that an oxymoron, Tyler? Kind of, I think it is. So, and we'll go through some things. Plants generally have a little bit of a range, and there's some things we can do to influence the nodes, but we're not going to probably go out there and find, a soybean plant that has 40 nodes on that main stem, right? So we kind of have some parameters in which we're working on. I also think, Tyler, these things are fickle, and we'll hit on this a little bit, but the amount of pods and flowers that we abort are really, really high, right? So that's a challenge. It's trying to, build these potential, clusters and pods, but it's very, very sensitive to stresses. And because of that, we end up losing a lot of that potential just from a standpoint of what pods and flowers we never even make it to seed fill. And then finally, they're pretty weakly rooted, right? If we think about the root system in a corn plant and then compare it to kind of that shallow branching, style in a soybean plant, we should expect them to be a little bit weaker just on accessing things like water and nutrients. And oh, by the way, if we struggle accessing water and nutrients, that's then going to impact all of the other things really above it, because that then becomes one of those limitations or bottlenecks. So we kind of have a lot of stuff going against us. So here's kind of a schematic, Tyler, and I borrowed this slide because I thought it did a really nice job, but it kind of walks through, if you look at the soybean plant's progression through its life. And then, last week, Tyler, I said, if a corn plant had a brain, what's it thinking about? You can kind of think about this in the same thing. If a soybean had a brain at different parts throughout the growing season, what is it thinking about? And if I look here, kind of this, R2.5, R3, R4.5 in that window, it's thinking about flowering, vegetative growth, pod development, and starting to fill seeds. So this is kind of that scatterbrained approach. It's got a lot going on as it's trying to develop. So, all right, this is all that good stuff, Tyler. I'm going to boil it down. And I think this is why sometimes, again, I think management strategies have to change when we think about corn versus soybeans. So to me, when I look at management by yield on corn, because of the way it grows, it's fairly linear, right? Because of the linear nature and how that plant progresses. If we say, hey, I want to attack one of those yield limiting windows in corn, we kind of can figure out, hey, what are those, what's that week or 2 day, 2 weeks, or what are those time frames I need to go and have a management, strategy in place to affect that. Whereas I think about soybeans, it's not always like that, right? When I think about soybeans, the management by yield maybe looks something like this, where it's like, okay, well, I think I kind of have an idea when I need to be doing something, but sometimes I get good yields and I didn't really do anything special. Sometimes I went and I made an extra trip of XYZ and I didn't really see anything. And yeah, we can generally see those lines, go up. But Tyler, it's way less. It seems like it often is way less a linear than what corn is. And so that can kind of become a little disheartening, right? I want to go grow beans. I want to go do things right. I want to drive yields, but it's not as simple sometimes as what it seems like corn is. Okay. So that's kind of some down in the dumps kind of stuff, right? So I'm going to ask, is there any hope? Do we even do anything? Like, are we just stuck with 50, 55, 60 bushel beans forever because we can't figure out, Mitch said we can't figure out how to manage them all. Um, should we even worry about them, Tyler?
Well, Mitch, I always tell people soybeans die at least 3 times a season.
They certainly do. They can look terrible. We write them off and but they are as fickle as I said they can be resilient, but it still is this question, if we're talking about yield enhancing strategies, what can we do, right? So is there any hope? Yes, there is. So some of you maybe have seen me use this slide before, but this is a pretty impressive looking soybean plant, right, Tyler? These are, yeah, we've all probably seen something that looks like this on the very end or, skip or something like that. But this is a picture of a soybean plant from the current new world record soybean yield that was set here this past growing season, which was 218 bushel soybeans, which 218 bushel soybeans, Tyler's, I just got done talking about how I struggle, sometimes to get, 60 or 65 or 70 consistently. And here we just said for all of those negatives, they at least have 218 bushel potential that exist in them. But I also know that the way that this soybean plant looks is way different than a lot of the soybean plants that we see in our day-to-day life. So what's different? I'm just going to call out a couple things that I see as differences or things that stick out to me just in the plant um, phenotype here versus what we see a lot of times, right? So the first thing that jumps out to me, Tyler, holy moly, look at that root mass. Okay, if I'm going to have all these pods, which is, this is a lot of times this is where everybody, looks at first. If I'm going to have all these pods and a lot of pods per cluster, again, they're typically weak rooted. I need to have as good of a base as I can to help with water access and nutrient access. So incredible root mass. Obviously, yeah, that's a pretty thick diameter. That probably is going to present some other challenges, but we'll hold that for another day. So the next thing that sticks out to me when I look at the soybean plant is branching. Okay, so I've got really good branching off of that main stem, but then I also have really good clusters off of those branchings. So it's pretty, I mean, we can get branching fairly easily, and obviously certain varieties branch differently than others, and we can influence some of that with population. But we've all probably seen some of those side branches that have like one or two pods on them, and they don't really contribute a whole lot. But in this picture, I was actually getting real productivity through that side branching. Okay, so next up on what I notice, again, just the health and the abundance of clusters in that mid canopy. And finally, the top, what, I've heard Jim Egrich, he calls this kind of like the golden nodes, right? This is where we get those extra, bushels. That's where that August rain gives us that last little pop, right? But those nodes up at the top are just as potted and just as full all the way throughout the nodes, all the way bottom. So obviously a very, very impressive plant. The challenge is, Tyler, that if I look at this plant, we talked about, how the plant is constantly kind of going through these different growth stages and doing multiple things at once. But in general, if I want to influence these things down here, I need to do something early in the season. If I'm going to try to influence root mass like that and side branching like that, I will never do that with an R3 application. Okay. So this is where that balancing thing comes back into place. So if I think that this structure is important to yield enhancement, I need to focus on certain things as the growing season progresses to try to help that plant along and through those bottlenecks. Okay. So with that, I said I was going to come back to greedy beans, Tyler, right? So here's my greedy beans. This is my example here. So if we think about this, so we just in our minds, we have a picture of what that super, super, super high yielding bean plant looked like. Okay. So if I want an example for this side branch and these nodes to be productive, I need to make sure that that trifoliate is healthy and is doing everything that it can to kind of help feed that node, right? So if I have a good trifoliate, I should expect to have pretty healthy and productive nodes beneath that trifoliate. Okay, and the opposite effect, if let's say up here, I've got a weak trifoliate, maybe it's got a disease, maybe it's nutrient short, maybe it's got insect feeding, hail, what have you. If I have something happen to that trifoliate, then I should expect that that node that that trifoliate is attached to be um, to be weak. Maybe it doesn't have any pods at all, or maybe it just keeps one pod and it's got two beans on it. But I should not expect that to be a super, super productive node, place to hang beans, if I have a weak trifoliate that's attached to it. So that's where I kind of use this analogy that if you look at a soybean plant from at the very end of the season, it's kind of like as I evaluate from top to bottom, you can almost look at it like it's tree rings. So, and for those of you, if you think back to fourth grade, science class, we all looked probably at tree rings or cross sections of leaves, and based off the growing season, those tree rings, if it was a stressful growing season, that tree didn't grow very much and it had a really narrow band. If it had a great growing season, that next tree ring was really wide. So you can almost look back in time at that tree ring and see where did that plant have stress or where was it really, really healthy. And a soybean plant is kind of similar because of the way that those trifoliates and those nodes progress throughout the season and how they respond to stress. So you can kind of look start to bottom back at that plant and understand where did I maybe have something that happened that influenced my yield either really positively or negatively. And then the big question is, and what can I do about it? So last week I went through what I kind of call these initial or these influential development phases for corn. So I kind of put together something similar here, Tyler, as well for soybeans. So as I think about throughout the growing season, what am I trying to do? What is that plant trying to do? And then if I feel a stress throughout that growing season, throughout those different time frames, can I make a management decision to impact that? But obviously still being aware that the main goal is limiting stress. Again, whether that's disease, water, nutrients, what have you, and then it's up to us then to kind of use these yield enhancing products to drive it the rest of the way. Okay, so very good. So, okay, how do we do that? I'm actually going to use these next couple slides are from the University of Illinois because I think they did a nice job of kind of summing up and kind of proving a little bit of this on node potential and pod potential and what that does to yield. But if you look at, in this case, this is looking at two different yielding soybeans. Okay, so 50 bushel beans versus 62 bushel beans. Okay, so 50 bushel beans, that is kind of this orange line. The higher yielding beans are the blue line. So this is looking at pod number by by nodes. Okay, so let's just start looking at the orangish yellow bar here first. So as you look at kind of this axis on the bottom, think about this here at 0. This is like the very, very base of the plant. This next bar, this check mark, that's to your 5th node, 10th node, 15th node, and 20 node at the top. And then it's looking at the average number of pods per node. So you can see down here on these 50 bushel beans at my 5th node, they're only averaging about a half of a pod per node. But once you got up into the 10th to 15th, so up higher in that canopy, right? That middle to top, part of that canopy, now you're starting to get to those 2.5 pods per node. And then you kind of start to tail off again once you get to the very, very top. So as I look at the 62 bushel soybeans, Tyler, really based off Illinois' data, I never got higher averages at the peak for pods per node, okay? But what I did do is I was able to get a higher number of pods per node on the bottom and a higher number of pods per node on that top. So from node 15 through 20, and then from node 0 to 5. So those higher yielding beans were doing a better job retaining and creating pods at the bottom, about the similar kind of that peak, productivity part of that plant, but then it was able to hold on longer and keep more productivity of pods as we got toward the top of that plant. Okay, great. That's nice. But what about, let's break that. That's just pods. Let's now look at seeds, because that's really, we harvest pods, but we care about seeds, right, Tyler? So this is looking at their number of seeds or seed number, and they're looking at meters squared here versus yield. Okay, so Tyler, I don't expect somebody to go out and count 4,000 soybeans, per meter squared, but some poor grad student had to at the University of Illinois. And what they saw is, no shocker, as we drove more seeds per area, my yields went up to, and that's a really good line, Tyler. That's pretty linear. That's a pretty good line. So I feel pretty comfortable with that, saying, okay, easy enough. I want higher yielding beans. I need more seeds. Duh. Okay. So, but what about the other part of it? So we also know that weight influences our final yields at the end of the year too. So looking at the same metrics, yeah, when they compared seed weight versus yield, you got a slight positive correlation, right? You still had that uptick where my highest yielding beans tended to be heavier, but it's not nearly as linear as necessarily as what that first one was. So how I'm going to talk about that is they are important. We need to be thinking about them together. But if I'm going to look at where my yield's coming from and what I can do to really try to influence yield, I need to look at how do I maximize my nodes, which then maximize my pods, which then impact my number of seeds. And then also at the same time be thinking about then how do I make those seeds as heavy as I can. But I'm probably going to, even though this bean weight thing is important, and I do think it is important for these higher yielding situations, we probably should spend maybe a little bit more time focusing on that seed number, just based off the linear nature in which that correlated with yield. Okay. And then understanding what are my bottlenecks to help address those so I can maximize both of those together. And then finally, Tyler, we talk about this idea of balance. And here's the crux. I didn't put this slide on here, but if you would look at seed number and seed weight, as your seed number goes up, what do you think your weight per seed does? It actually goes down if you look at that Illinois data, which makes sense when you think about the balancing act, right? So if we really want to get to those uber high yields, we got to figure out a way to get both of them together. And that's where some of those yields are coming from. But at first, we probably need to focus on that seed number and then try to get that seed weight as we go. So now back to a little bit of the review from last week for those of you who maybe missed this. So we're going to talk now, we're going to start to pivot from here on out to how do we address those bottlenecks with some of these yield enhancing products. And again, guys, I'm not talking about fungicides today. I'm not talking about seed treatments. I'm not talking about weed control or micronutrient, foliar micronutrients. We know those are a part of it, but we really want to focus in on these other types of yield enhancing products. So I'm going to focus on PGRs, biostimulants, and biologics. So Tyler, these are the things that sometimes get grouped into the snake oil, category, right? But I think if we're going to try to have the most success, and again, I believe strongly that having success in these products comes down to placement and what we're trying to impact, but we have to understand the strengths and the weaknesses of each of these categories, right? So when I think of plant growth regulators, PGRs, in my head, I just start to assume or be thinking about, hey, this is a product that's going to trigger the plant to do something, okay? They are going to elicit a certain reaction or a growth reaction. There are already PGRs that exist in that plant. They already drive functions within the plant. We're trying to add more onto it or into that plant to try to drive a more aggressive response, okay? So if I think about, there's pros and cons, but if I think about bottlenecks that PGRs are very good at addressing, they're very good at addressing slow, stagnant growth. again, because I'm going to trigger growth, I'm going to trigger reaction. And they're very good at helping optimize different things in plant structure and stay green. Okay, so that's what I want to think about PGRs. Biostimulants, our next camp. These, I think about a product, and again, they are usually plant derived or they're animal derived, but these are substances that we apply that essentially make the plant do something better. Okay, so this is all about upregulating. So these substances that we put on that plant help upregulate a process in that plant that helps them do XYZ. So a lot of times these can be overcoming stress, but sometimes there are some of these different biostimulants that can also help upregulate pieces that are what I'm going to call offensive responses, which is like helping move nutrients, helping just the plant be more efficient in general. And then finally, we get to our last bucket, which is the true biologics. So these are living things. And when I think of biologics, I automatically think of adding something into a system that I'm going to ask a living thing do something for or along with that plant. And I'm going to hope, Tyler, that whatever I ask that thing to do is going to be beneficial for that plant to help it overcome a bottleneck. So this is a very wide group of products, but in general, it's all about harnessing symbiotic relationships. Whatever we add into that system is going to get something in return for doing something for that plant. They both have to win in order for it to truly, truly work. Okay, so there are biopesticides, there are biofungicides, there's a lot of bio things today, but in general, in today's context, we're going to talk about things that are helping or biologics that are helping with nutrient access. So either solubilizing, which that means making something in the soil that's already there more available to that plant, or fixing. So a microbe that is taking nitrogen out of the air and giving it to soybeans. And Tyler, I know everybody on this group, has been working with biologics, especially in soybeans, for a long, long time. Like, right? Inoculating soybeans that's the OG of biologics, right? We've known that for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years that those microbes that we can apply to soybeans are able to fix that nitrogen and help that plant, through those processes. So not a new concept, especially for soybeans. Okay, so that brings us then to understanding and kind of bring us back to this bio-verified process. I know I hit on this last week. If you guys were able to be on our biologics seminar here earlier this week, I know they hit on this. But really, in those three buckets I just talked about, there are oodles and oodles and oodles of products that exist. So bio-verified is nothing more than Winfield United's attempt to kind of vet through those different products that are on the market and try to understand what are some of those best places to start looking at, some of those best products that give us our best likelihood for return, and kind of trying to hone us in on a list that we can use to kick us off. So we are looking at 4 criteria as we evaluate all those products, right? So we're looking at uniqueness of a product, the agronomic strengths and weaknesses of a product. Do we understand how it works? Does it have repeatable data? Does it always translate to yield? Those kinds of things. We're also looking at operational efficiency of a product. If we're going to ask somebody to go and turn the world upside down to make a biologic type product work, we know that in the real world that might not work, right? And then finally, economic return. So we're evaluating those 4 things to come up with what we think that vetted list is. So Tyler, last week I had this up and I kind of hedged myself and I said, hey guys, the list I show you today might not be the list that you see because we're constantly going through these things, right? And lo and behold, we got the updated 2025 quarter 1 list between last week. So this is just kind of a quick summary of those main products that are currently on that bio-verified process. So this is a mix of corn products. This is a mix of soybean products. This is a mix of PGRs, biostimulants, and biologics. So today what we're going to do is we're really going to focus on 4 of these that I think, Tyler, are the best opportunity for us to hone in on soybeans and help us address some of those bottlenecks. And just like last week, we got to at least kind of start with what is the way that we can increase the efficiency or the consistency of these yield enhancers. So number 1, we got to identify the bottleneck in which we're trying to solve. So again, for today, nodes, pods, beans, and weight. Those are the bottlenecks that we are really going to try to influence. Okay. Then we have to select the category of those products that works best, whether it's the PGRs, biostims, biologics, and I'm going to use that bio-verified list as kind of that funnel to get me to the right, product or two for me to take a look at. Okay. Next step is understanding the placement of it, because there might be different placements where these things work better. And then finally apply it correctly, and then evaluate that product in season, right? So both in season and post season, just so that we understand, did we solve what we went out to try to impact? Okay. So now, Tyler, let's actually get into the real true bottlenecks. So bottleneck number one. So if I'm going to try to influence nodes per acre, Tyler, that plight starts right away in the season. So again, I told you University of Illinois had some nice data. So this is just an example of one of the easiest ways to influence my nodes per acre, and that's planting date, right? I'm not going to sit here and tell you when you should or shouldn't plant, but the moral of the story is if you are going into decent conditions, and you can overcome some of things like frost and some of those other challenges that we know we have in general, if you can get that plant and keep it alive healthy, the earlier you plant, again, to an extent, the more nodes that you have. So this is looking at 4 different planting dates, and then looking at the average number of nodes for each of those planting dates. Okay, so obviously my earlier, kind of my quote unquote on time plants, more nodes versus my ones that I had to get really late with, right? But I kind of like this next slide best because, okay, great, 20 to 21 to 17 to 12 nodes. Is that really that big of a deal? Well, it is if you multiply those differences by 140,000 plants per acre. So that's why I really like these numbers here. So now this is truly looking at the total number of nodes per acre. So if I could optimize that, I had almost 3 million nodes per acre versus all the way down here where I got planted really late, or later than I wanted to, 2.4 all the way down to 1.7 million nodes per acre. When I start thinking in millions, Tyler, that starts making me that catches my attention. So great, Tyler. We're gonna listen to what Mitch or the University of Illinois said. We're gonna go try to plant soybeans, right? We're gonna try to go out there and go early. That's great. But what happens if we go out there too early and we get into stressful environments and we end up with poor stands? Like we all know that soybeans compensate, but if we're trying to, again, go for these high yields, we want to make sure that we get those plants out there consistently as possible, that we get that crucial, planting population up, and that we are giving each of those plants the equal amount of access to sunlight and nutrients throughout the rest of the year. So John Zook made a comment on the webinar earlier this week on the bio-verified biologic update. And he said, we always think about corn as needing those picket fences, right, Tyler? I don't know if you heard, if you remember this comment. And he said, usually on soybeans, we don't care. Like if we get a stand out there, it might come up over the course of 5 to 10 weeks. As long as we end up with plants out there, singulation don't matter. Like we're usually pretty happy, right? So I'm going to put this picture up here, looking at a stand of soybeans that are coming up. Tyler, I look at this stand down this row. I would never, ever, 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 ever in a million years recommend going and ripping this stand up. No, right? It's good. But as I start to look at the details, okay, I got some more doubles, I got some late emergers, I got some skips. As I keep going down here, I could probably find some that are, 5 days behind. I'll probably find some that are dead. This might be good for 60 bushel or 60, 65 bushel soybeans. But if I'm trying to challenge myself on how do I get more consistently to 80 or 85, this might not be good enough, especially if I'm going to go try to maximize those nodes per acre and plant early. So if I think about this as being a stress and trying to get those plants out of the ground early, specifically with early planting, let's come back now to our 3 buckets of products and what should I be most inclined to use? So if we think about the strengths and weaknesses, to me, this early season piece, Tyler, it's all about PGRs. Like to me, slow stagnant growth, optimizing plant structure, triggering the plant to do something. I feel really good that a PGR can probably help me overcome those early season stresses. And if I'm going to plant early, to help me get that plant stand off to a better start than even just using, fungicide, insecticide alone. So how can we use PGRs to drive that? So I showed this last week, guys, but it still plays just as much of a role today. If I think of PGRs, there's really three main ones that are commercially used in the industry for row crops. So the first one is gibberellic acid. And oh, by the way, all of these three kind of do some different things. So gibberellic acid is all about stretch. These are stretchers. You can see that if you look at this picture comparing just untreated corn and soybeans versus then on the right-hand side, corn and soybeans that we applied GEA or gibberellic acid to. And Tyler, look at the soybean plant. To me, this one's crazy. Like I totally was able to stretch out those internodes, and apparently it does something really, really great, right? But I want to keep coming back to what's different in my roots. All I did was I triggered super above ground growth. That can be good, but at a balance. So let's look at then our next PGR. So this is an auxins. So if you guys remember from last week, auxins, cell differentiation, and root growth. So when you think auxin, I want you to be thinking root, root, root. So again, let's look at the soybean plant here treated with auxins. Look at the roots on that thing versus just the untreated soybean plant here on the left. Crazy amount of root hairs and root development where I triggered that auxin. But Tyler, when I just look at auxin alone, what's my above ground look like? What's my vegetation look like there? It's not very good. Like we actually went backwards at the expense of creating those roots off that plant. So we have to be thinking about balance. So if I'm going to cause the plant to do something, I need to make sure I have it in balance so that at the end of the day, we're helping that plant out and not actually being detrimental to the overall health of that plant. So this is where we are going to bring in the first product here of the day, guys. And this is Ascend ST3. And Ascend ST3 is a product that's brand new that we are very, very excited about. And why are we excited about Ascend ST3? If you guys think about Ascend Squared, here the most recent Ascend product for corn, we did something where we changed some ratios around. And we made something what we called auxin dominant. And that's exactly what we did with Ascend ST3. So it's not the exact same mix or ratio as Ascend Squared, but we kind of took that same kind of strategy where we want it to be root based, but still have enough of the other PGRs, specifically GA, to help with the above ground portion, so that it's still balanced, but we're still enhancing that root growth. Okay. The other thing we did is because we want this to be used as an addition to your F&I seed treatment, is we had to make sure that it handles really well and that it's nice with your inoculant. Okay. So we were able to do those things with Ascend ST3. So Ascend ST3 product that is focused solely on soybeans and trying to be added to that seed treatment to help get that plant out of the ground faster, more consistently, and to drive root growth. So that's the idea. Okay. And because of that, guys, we were able to build in and actually get 2 patents protecting that product. So you guys don't have to worry about somebody and coming in and saying, hey, I've got the same thing as Ascend S23, right? If they say that, they're not right. So this is a product we really are comfortable with. And again, it's going to treat well, but we always want that to be in addition to your F&I seed treatment. So Tyler, I'm going to skip around just because I've been blah, blah, blahing here quite a bit. So this is, I think, the fun part where we look at the agronomy. So does it work? So this, guys, is a picture looking at untreated on the top, Warden CX2. So think about this as kind of that premium fungicide insecticide mix. And then in this bottom, we added Ascend ST3 to that Warden CX2 mix. Now, this is what we call a gradient table. So on the right-hand side of this table, this is where the soil is 55 degrees. On the left-hand side, this table kind of slowly gets cooler all the way down to 50. And if we look at then the progression of emergence with untreated, pretty spotty, right? All the way through. We add the Warden CX2. Yeah, it's a little bit better. I've got more beans that are coming up, but it's still not perfect, especially when you get down to these cooler soils. When I had that plant triggered response, when I added that Ascend ST3, all of a sudden, now whether it's at 50 or 55, I've got a way more consistent stand of soybeans coming up. Okay, so this is really, really important, guys, if we want to get those beans up and out of the ground consistently, similar timing, maximize those nodes per acre, and allow ourselves to, limit the potential stresses of planting into cooler soils. Tyler, there's days I wish I could get 55-degree soil temps, right? We all know that we might have really good soil temps, go plant some corn, go plant some soybeans, and then we always go into those, those 10-day stretches where we're lucky to even hit 50, right? So we know this is a real stress, and we think that this is a nice potential solution to that bottleneck. Okay, so just a couple more pictures of does it work? So here, this is the same picture, just one in black and white. Besides my poor grass control, Tyler, I want to compare just kind of the health and vigor where I had the PGR added, versus just the standard base F&I. Okay, and I think especially with that black and white, you can really see the health and vigor of that stand where we use those PGRs to get that plant going. Okay, but Tyler, what did I say was the main job of auxins? Roots, right? So it's one thing to get the plant up and out of the ground, but if we're establishing big, healthy plants, we need to make sure we're establishing big, healthy roots, right? So remember looking at our 218 bushel soybeans, the health and the vigor of those roots. So when I look at Ascend ST3 with that auxin dominant, this is again a couple infield pictures. I just want you to compare and look at, yeah, great. The above ground stuff is nice, right? That's helping with our node development per acre. But look at the rooting mass compared to just your base, F&I seed treatments. Okay, so we're getting two benefits out of one product with that PGR Ascend ST3. Okay, and then finally, just some data for the number of people. And we've been looking at this product for a while, and on average, we're getting about a 1.5 bushel response when we add Ascend ST3 to that F&I base. Okay, so pretty nice piano chart, Tyler. This is a product that we think is going to have a nice fit for us, helping solve one of those bottlenecks. And guess what? Doing it in a fairly economic way. So you guys don't get bought in necessarily or pay too much attention. We're just kind of playing with some numbers just to look at the yield response relative to the price of the crop, relative to, ballpark pricing, and just focus here on this column here, looking at your return on investment. Tyler, it's pretty hard to find products that are, 5, 6, 7 to 1 ROIs, no matter what products we're looking at. So again, we think that this product solves a real agronomic issue and hopefully does it in a way that's economical for people to be willing to try to utilize that product with them. So that's our bottleneck number one. Let's jump into bottleneck number two. It's kind of, Tyler, it's kind of like same bottleneck, just at a different time of the year. But because, again, we got to remember the way that plant's growing, we might have to attack it slightly differently. So my next opportunity after I get that plant going, guys, to influence my nodes per acre is to influence my branching. Okay, so if I think about influencing my branching, again, back to looking at that super high yielding plant, we got great laterals. How we're going to have to do that is we're going to attack it a slightly different way. So looking at Ascend, and you guys are going to get tired of probably me talking about Ascend, but when I think Ascend, Tyler, I think there's a lot of great opportunity to utilize the Ascend family in soybeans, specifically, the ST3 followed by Ascend SL. So this is kind of where we're going to get into the details of Ascend SL versus ST3. But now with SL, Tyler, now we've kind of retweaked those ratios versus ST3. Now with Ascend SL, I'm going to talk about a product that still has gibberellic acid, still has those auxins, but now it's got a little bit more of a product or a PGR we call cytokinin. And we're not going to go through all these bullet points, Tyler, but when I think of cytokinin, cytokinins help with they help with some stay green and some health, but they also help kind of that plant decide how it wants to grow. So cytokinins can have an influence in that plant structure and can help us trigger additional branching. So, and if I'm trying to influence my pods per acre, cytokinins now become a pretty important or a pretty valuable way that we can do that. So enter Ascend SL sprayed on vegetatively. So what I want you to look at here is on the left, this is untreated check. On this next one to the right, this is where I just had Ascend ST3. And then finally, these two plants on the farthest right, now I went at V3, Tyler, and put on Ascend SL. So just kind of look, if you're able to look at your screens or look at your phones, we were able to certainly influence more side branching when I had that product that contained the cytokinins. So this is going to be a busy one, but I think it's really neat, Tyler, so I'm going to spend a couple minutes on it. Okay, so this is looking at several different treatments on soybeans. And sometimes, Tyler, people look at these soybeans are like, wow, did you get white mold or you really like the cyclones or like what do you got going on with these soybeans? And really, this was an idea that I thought would take a couple minutes, ended up taking a lot longer than that. But what I wanted to do, guys, is based off the different treatments that I had, I wanted to spray paint different parts of the plant I was trying to influence with those different treatments. Okay. So what I want us to focus on right now is just the branches that are spray painted yellow. Because what I did there is I just spray painted the branches or the laterals. And this is, I think, Tyler, I can't remember if this was 8 or 10 plants. These aren't just single plants. But I wanted to show the differences in laterals between the different treatments. Okay, so this first box here on the left, this is just your untreated check. Okay, everything else that I have boxed here on the right, this all had Ascend SL in different formula or in different applications. So what I want us just to look quick at is just look at your yellow branching and then compare that back to the first untreated. And the number one question, I don't want us to look at pods, I just want to look at yellow branching. And I could show that all the way through that where I had that Ascend SL with that cytokinin based, I was able to trigger more branching when I applied that then foliarly. Okay, so that's kind of during the vegetative state. Let's look at the reproductive state. So once I get into reproductive, Tyler, I'm no longer really triggering side branching or extra laterals. I can still influence my nodes, but now I'm more influencing my nodes upwards and not outwards. So this is again, this is a different treatment from or a different trial from a few years ago, looking at untreated on the left, then that V3 application of Ascend SL trying to trigger the laterals and the branching. But then if I come back at R1 again, can I continue then to trigger that node development at this point, building off of what I had already done and trying to start to drive that fuller canopy ahead? Okay, so this is cool, Tyler. This is, this is just demos. Do we actually have, anything with research on this? So some of you maybe have seen this, but this is actually from a master's project that a student did here a few years ago in central Iowa, looking at the influence on Ascend SL on soybeans. And you could see that foliar application. I'm looking at this one here in the middle, Tyler. Yeah, we were able to trigger some additional, biomass. And especially once you peel back the petioles, you could really see some differences. Okay. And then what did that end up with? If I said nodes was important for this student, for his 3-year average, he was able to increase his nodes per plant by about 1.4 nodes per plant when we had that Ascend application. Okay, so did it translate to yield? So guys, this is looking at 4 different years of yield data with Ascend SL on soybeans. And you can kind of see the difference. The difference here, these bottom 3, again, these are central Iowa. These were part of that master's project. And then here up here, this is more answer plot data. But we're still triggering that additional benefit of yield based off giving ourselves the opportunity for more nodes and more node development. Okay. But Tyler, do we get paid on nodes? No, we get paid on beans. So the nodes are great, but we've got to do something with them. Okay, so now we get to our last and final bottleneck, and that's retaining the flowers and pods and then transitioning that to seed weight. Because at the end of the day, if we think back to that Venn diagram, that's where we're making the money, is when we can influence all of those. So here's the caveat, Tyler. I talked about how fickle soybeans are. This almost is kind of like counterintuitive, but this is some answer plot work from a few years ago in Minnesota. The higher my yields were, actually the more plant or the more pods and flowers I aborted. Okay, so now that probably means I had more flowers to abort, but you never truly can kind of catch up by yourself. Okay, so we've got to always be fighting that, where it's just not just nodes, it's not just flowers, but how do we increase the actual, pods and we're filling them. So here's one good way, Tyler. Again, this is some more of that Illinois data. If I want to influence my number of pods per node, pretty easy, just fertilize them. So again, this blue or this bluish kind of bar, this is again looking at those nodes from 5 up till 20. And I was able to influence, because I have less nutrient stress, more pod retention per node. Okay, so this is kind of where some of that yield gain was coming from. Okay, but again, we've got to understand kind of that balance. So I'm going to kind of go through this quick, guys, but we also got to remember when we're trying to create and keep that plant healthy, we are pulling stuff up from the soil at the same time that we're shoving stuff in from the leaves, right? Like it's got to have both of them together. So if I look at, this core period where we are, adding more of those pods and we're really starting to get to the sweet spot here, right? Like that R3 to R6 time frame. I've got between dry matter accumulation and nutrients, I've got about a month window where it's going to add 40 to 50% of biomass to that plant. Okay. So where that biomass now at this point and this bottleneck starts to come from is keeping those keeping those nodes healthy so we can keep those pods. But now we're into that filling them period. So if I think about our bottlenecks and our three different products and what can I use to fill, access, drive nutrients, now I'm probably leaning more, Tyler, towards this biologic bucket, right? So things that are going to help me fix and solubilize and provide extra nutrients to all of those developing pods and seeds that we have. Okay, so let's again then go back to our bio-verified list and figure out which of those products we want to work with. So this first one, guys, we're going to talk about Dash. So we hit Dash PBC last week, so planter box corn. We also have a specific Dash PBS, planter box soybeans. So what this is, guys, is it is 8 different strains of microbes that all do something a little bit different in the soil. And so if we think about what they should be doing, they should be, if we're catering this towards soybeans with this mix of 8, they should be helping us with nitrogen and they should be helping us solubilize those other nutrients so that we can then fill and keep those pods and those beans as heavy as we can. So we're doing that, Tyler, via a product that is going to be kind of that lubrication, kind of seed finisher type of product, that planter box type of product. So we're going to have those 8 strains of microbes that are helping us with that nutrient access. But we're going to be adding this as either a planter box treatment or if you've got, some type of metering equipment that you can do it with your tender. We want to make sure that we get that product covered on the seed because as soon as that seed goes in the ground, then that microbial consortium is going to be able to kind of start colonizing and building that system to provide us those nutrients throughout the rest of the year. So that's what's going to help us then feed that plant a little bit better than normal as we go through all those different life cycles. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of these different strains, but just understand each of those strains kind of work together, but they focus on different nutrients. So everything from phosphorus, calcium, nitrogen, sulfur, potassium, moly. So the goal with this mix is to have kind of that full encompassing blend of microbes that are going to help us through all those stress windows for nutrients for soybeans. Okay. I'm gonna keep clicking through. And Tyler is just kind of some experimental stuff I've observed over the last couple of years with kind of that base. But I did want to make sure we finish up here quick and then get to our last biologic, which is, again, I kind of mentioned or alluded to this, like this is the original one, right, guys? Like we know nitrogen is a big, big deal for soybeans, and we know that inoculating and helping colonize that root zone is really, really important. So we want to focus again, because this is a biologic, just on what we think is one of those top key inoculants to be used with soybeans. Okay, so looking at Vault IP Plus. So again, not to belabor it, but looking at how important nitrogen can be and what kind of role those microbial inoculants can play. Tyler, I look at this picture over here, right? Like if I didn't have enough nodules to feed that plant, does it matter how much ascend or anything else I had on that plant? No, it doesn't, because if I can't feed what I developed, that's when we go backwards. So I want us to be thinking about in general, as we are driving plant physiology and trying to increase our nodes, increase our opportunity for beans, increase all that good stuff. We can't just be triggering responses, but we have to feed them at the same time. Okay, your growers don't just want viney beans with no pods and no seeds, right? If we really are focused on how do we drive this yield enhancing concept, we got to drive the plant structure and we have to feed the plant structure if we really want to get the most out of this whole system. Okay. And Tyler, I said I wasn't going to hit this, but you know me, I love my foliar micronutrients. So I have to put one last, kind of little plug in here. If you don't want to do the Dash PBC or PBS or all that good stuff, we know, guys, that there are certain micronutrients that are really, really important to feeding those soybeans. So manganese, boron, and zinc also plays a role too. So when we look at max and Z and B plus, if we're in those crucial windows where we know that we're developing pods and we're triggering growth and we know we need to feed growth, Tyler, what an absolute slam dunk opportunity to be pairing up a foliar feed with those PGRs as we're triggering that growth so that we can trigger growth, feed that growth, and turn that into productive nodes. Okay. So, which kind of brings me to my last kind of wrap up again, because I think this sums up everything really well, Tyler. Again, looking at untreated here on the left. Okay. So, not bad beans. Then, as I start going through my different ascend regiment. Okay, so 1, 2, and 3 shot of ascend. I'm able to drive more branching. I'm able to drive more clusters kind of through the top if I compare back to my untreated. But here's where I think it gets cool. Now let's compare in this third box. I want us just to look at the density of the red pods, the density of the white pods, and compare that to the plant immediately to its left. So the difference, guys, here is this plant that has a higher density of pods all the way through. That's where we had the micronutrient foliar feed piece included with that PGR. So I was able to get more opportunities, Tyler, with just the PGR itself, but where I went and fed that growth, the density of my pods was noticeably different because I was able to address that fickle nature of that soybean plant. And then I know, Tyler, this is not meant to be a fungicide discussion, but like I said, there's requirements, prerequisites to all of this, and keeping them healthy was one of them. These last two then have the addition, so kind of the stair step up with fungicide. So if I look at this last bundle and I just look at the density of clusters on, the top of the plant, the middle part of the plant, and then through the laterals, that's where we kind of had that full uh, cocktail or that full plan to address all of those bottlenecks throughout the entirety of the growing season. So with that, we got 2 minutes left. Just remember this, guys: nodes, pods, seeds, and try to help get some weight while we're at it, and then pick out those right products to help us address those bottlenecks. And oh, by the way, Tyler, same thing as last week. If you guys look at your good, better, best, high yielding documents from Winfield United, we have these already included in those strongest agronomic recommendations to help us influence yield to the best of what we can. So, Tyler, I took us to 8:58.
All right.
You want to give us a quick update on what we're going to be doing next week, and then I will flash the QR code after that for those of you who want CC8 credits.
Yeah, and for those of you guys that weren't on right away here too, I reposted the registration link for the regional conference again, February 19th and 20th. There's a charge for that, so just make sure you're aware of that. But it will be a really, really good lineup. We got a lot of great speakers coming in. Pretty dang excited for that. Next week, we are going to be with Scott Geyer for half of the session. Just talking about some on the economics and specifically around some of the services Winfield United offers with Secure and the RX programs and some of those things. And then for the second half, I'm going to spend some time going through. I've been getting a lot of questions lately on like comparing different herbicides and active ingredients, what's in them, those type of things. So I'm just going to spend that half an hour going through some of the calculations you can do to figure out, okay, this one has this much acetylchlor, this one has this much. So you can actually go through and compare apples to apples there. And so that's kind of what we're looking at. Mitch, I know that you got to get on the road here, so if you want, I can actually